Welcome to the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. This is Unit 6, and we'll be talking about grammar and focusing on form, meaning, and use. The questions we'll try to answer in this video is, what is grammar and how should instructors teach it? And also, what do teachers need to know about grammar? Grammar is one of the 4 language systems, along with pronunciation, vocabulary, and culture. The more instructors understand how the grammar of English works, the better they'll be at explaining it to their students. There's lots of different ways to define grammar, but here is one key way to think about it. We often think of grammar as rules that control how words are formed and how sentences are formed. And although that is a fairly common way to describe grammar, other language educators suggest that maybe we should go beyond just thinking about language as being rules. Instead, we might think of grammar as chains and slots. So chains is how we're linking words together, and slots are the words that we could put in to a sentence. So that's another way of thinking about it. Still yet another way to think about grammar is it's not so much rules, but patterns and reasons for those patterns. And the reason to think of it this way is that sometimes there are aspects of English that don't seem to easily fit rules. Things that are unusual patterns that are less common. So if we think of it as patterns, we can help students understand, in order to be proficient in the language, we want to learn what are the common patterns of the language. And we want to understand, whenever we can, why those patterns exist. But to also understand that there's lots of variation, because grammar can change depending on our dialect and depending on the context in which we're using the language. It's also important as we talk about grammar to make a distinction between what linguists would call prescriptive grammar and descriptive grammar. Prescriptive grammar is where we try to say, here's the rules, you must follow these rules in order to have correct grammar. Descriptive grammar is instead, how are people using the language? What can we learn from these patterns so that we can reproduce these patterns in socially acceptable ways? I would say that I generally tend towards the prescriptive grammar, but I didn't always. Usually new teachers tend towards the prescriptive grammar, and here's the rules, and we've got to follow the rules. But the more we learn about language and how complex it is and how it's used differently in different contexts, the more likely we are to turn towards the descriptive grammar aspect. And this is a healthy position to present to students. That really, it's not so much, here's the rules and we've got to follow the rules, because the rules change a lot. But instead, what are the patterns and how can we find the patterns and mimic the patterns that are most appropriate for what we want to accomplish with the language? Another way to think about grammar is that grammar is full of making choices. And that's really what we need to do. We need to understand the patterns so we can make the choices that accomplish what we want to do. And the whole purpose of making these choices is to balance the difference between clarity and ambiguity. The clearer our grammar is, the more likely someone is to understand our message. If we have trouble with our grammar, it can lead to ambiguity, where the meaning is not clear. Now, sometimes there's a good reason to be ambiguous. In poetry, or when we want to leave something open to multiple interpretations. But generally, the clearer our grammar is, the more likely our message is to be clearly understood. Diane Larson-Freeman, an expert in the field of English grammar, suggests that when we learn about grammar and we teach it, we should keep 3 things in mind, 3 parts of grammar. And that's the form, the structures, the meaning, okay, and then the use. The way to think about this, as we mentioned, the form is about the structure, the meaning is the semantics. This is a linguistic term that has to do with the meaning behind the words or the structures. And then the use, we think about that as pragmatics. Pragmatics is the appropriateness of using one form versus another and the impact that that has on an audience. There are multiple grammatical forms in English, for instance, that have essentially the same basic meaning. But those forms can change in order to better fit a social context. Some other questions that you can use to represent these 3 aspects of grammar is how is the structure formed, what does it mean, and when and why is that structure used over another structure that might have the same meaning. This gets into the idea of register. Register is a linguistic term, and essentially it means the style of the language. We change our register depending on the situation that we're in. We speak differently and we use different grammar when we're in one setting versus another setting. So essentially, when we want to create register that's appropriate for a context, we need to be thinking about the grammar that we're using, the vocabulary choices we make, and also our pronunciation. And we can change all of those things to fit a different register or a different style that's most appropriate for a different audience in a different setting. Why should we teach grammar? There's some people who say we shouldn't, that grammar should just be learned through exposure, and over time people are just going to pick up grammar. But generally, most educators today admit that teaching at least some grammar helps students, and so we should be teaching it. And part of the reason is that students just simply expect it. Students, especially older learners, expect that when they learn a language, someone will help them learn the grammar of the language. What are the patterns and rules? At the same time, we know that most students will benefit from it, especially depending on the form of the instruction and the feedback that's around grammar. So there's enough of an argument to say it's worth it. Let's teach it. So what do teachers need to know in order to teach grammar? Well, one thing, they need to know the morphology. We talked about this in the vocabulary unit. Morphology is how words are formed, word endings, the affixes and the prefixes, and how do we create new words. So that's an important part of grammar. Another part is knowing the parts of speech. Parts of speech are things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, articles. How do we know about all these different slots and how do we use them? Also, we need to know about verbs, the different verb forms, and then the different functions of those verbs, about past and future, and how do we make questions, and all sorts of other aspects of what we would describe as sentence types, or syntax is the linguistic term. How do we order words within a sentence in order to make our meaning clear? So those are all things that an English teacher needs to understand about English in order to teach grammar to students. So in this video, we've briefly come up with a definition for grammar. We've talked about the debate whether we should teach grammar or not, and what are the things that we need to know in order to teach that grammar.